Hi, I'm James Allison, and I'm here to answer your questions about the Portuguese Grand Prix. This has been a season of lots of new tracks for us, and it does cause us some headaches, perhaps not the headaches you might expect. We've got to figure out new hotels, we've got to figure out which airports to go to, how to get the team there and back, etc., etc. I imagine that's not high up the list of things that people think of as challenges when we go to a new track, but it's all got to be organised. Probably most people are imagining what sort of headaches does it give us technically preparing a car for a track that we have not been to before or we haven't been to for many, many years. Well, there too, going to a new track certainly increases the workload, and it does add a layer of uncertainty to us because we don't have a long checklist of all the things that might have gone wrong at that track in the past. And we don't have detailed knowledge of the way in which the car is going to behave. But we have pretty good simulation tools, so as long as we know what the asphalt looks like, how rough it is, and the layout of the curbs and the racing line, we can get a pretty good estimate of what we need to go quickly at that track. And like any track really, a new circuit, or one we're very used to, the biggest challenge, the biggest thing that makes a difference to whether it's a good weekend or a bad weekend is whether or not we can get the tyres really singing for us. If we can get them working happily in their working range, front and rear axle, and the car nicely balanced. If we can do that, we're going to have a good weekend. If you've been in our garage in the dying minutes of Q3, you'd understand very well why Valtteri took a different approach to Lewis. It's because we didn't know what was the right thing to do. It was a very unusual set of circumstances with a tyre that was proving a little recalcitrant and where it was difficult to get the best out of that soft tyre in qualifying. And we had found in the second qualifying session that the medium tyre actually gave us our best lap so far of the qualifying session. And so when we were going into Q3, when it was proving pretty tight on the soft rubber, we were thinking, well, we've got a brand new set of mediums still sitting in the garage on heat. Why don't we use that? But that's not a normal pattern. Normally you choose the softest rubber. And so we were sort of slightly off kilter anyway, contemplating using this medium rubber. And then if you're going to use the medium rubber, what's the best way to use it? Well, do you just go out and hit it once with one flying lap, one lap of fuel in the car, and therefore minimize the mass of the car? Or do you give yourself two goes at it and have a chance to get the tyre maybe a little bit warmer on a track where it was proving difficult to get the tyres up to temperature anyway, and on a compound that's a bit stiffer, the medium, than the soft, and where it might prove awkward to get it really, really happily in its temperature window? And we offered this option to both our drivers, and they chose a different path. I think Lewis chose 2 laps because in Q2, when he was on the medium tyre, that had been his experience. He felt that he got the better performance later. Whereas Valtteri had hit Q2 with the medium tyre, hit it on the first lap, and got an absolutely brilliant lap out of it. He chose that in Q3 as his best shot. Lewis chose the other path, and ultimately Lewis just shaded it. But it was a really, really difficult choice where we placed in the driver's hands making that decision. And it was quite a tense period in the garage while they were weighing that up and while the clock was ticking down. The start to the Portuguese Grand Prix was one of the most exciting that we've had in some while. We occupied the front row, but we didn't keep those positions very long, with both our cars suffering to find grip in those early corners. And in fact, Lewis suffering worse than Valtteri and losing initially his lead to Valtteri, but then being swarmed all over by a McLaren as well. It was a very, very difficult period, those first few corners, and indeed those first few laps. And it was a result of probably several factors building up to produce a situation where a car that had been decently on pole was suddenly then being bothered on all sides by marauding folk from behind. All of it had its root in the fact that our tyres were too cold. We were running the medium tyre we qualified on the medium tyre, and we chose to qualify on the medium tyre because we were pretty confident that would give us the best performance over the race as a whole. We were worried that the soft tyre was going to have a very difficult time in the first stint, as indeed we subsequently saw to be the case. But the downside of going with that medium tyre is it's going to be harder to make it wake up and work nicely when the track is cold. So most of the people behind us were on the soft tyre. So straight away, they had a rubber that was going to be able to sort of get going quicker and wake up more quickly on a very cold track. And that general problem was exacerbated by two other factors. Firstly, at the start of the race, there was a very brief rain shower that just took away more temperature and also increased the greasiness of the surface. So that made the grip even lower. And then the second factor was that when the cars do their parade lap out to the formation lap out to the grid, then they're making the tyre warmer as they go round. That's one of the sort of main tasks, is to get some temperature into that tyre. Then when they form up on the grid ahead of the start, as soon as they stop, that tyre is cooling down. And the people in pole position and on the front rows of the grid sit there for many, many seconds while the back end of the grid is still forming. And so the people at the back end of the grid still have warm tyres, and that warmth gradually drops off as you get nearer to the front. So we're on the medium rubber, which gives us a disadvantage straight away in this cold, wettish weather. And then behind us, we have cars that are still warmer because they've been standing still for less time. All those things contributed to make it so that at the beginning of that race, it was pretty dicey for a while. But eventually, the work that the car does in the corners allows the temperature to build, and then once it gets above a sort of critical level, then the grip really starts arriving in droves, and then you start to see the basic competitiveness of the car reasserted, and we were able to get ourselves back to the front of the race. Thanks to everyone on Weibo who submitted their questions, and particularly this one where you pointed out that at a certain stage of the race early on, Lewis was complaining about how his front left tyre felt. And then later on that same set of tyres, he was reporting that the tyres felt good. How could that be? Same tyres, initially feeling poor and then feeling good. It's relatively straightforward to explain. The tyre was suffering from a thing called graining, and in fact graining was a big feature of the race, especially for the people running on the soft rubber. But even on the medium rubber that we were on at the time, they're still susceptible to graining, albeit at a lower level. Now, what is graining? Graining is a form of failure of the rubber of the tyre, where the rubber is adhering really well to the asphalt, so sticking beautifully the surface of the tyre to the asphalt, but it's sticking really well, and as the tyre starts to load up in a corner, then it turns out that the rubber, under certain circumstances, is not actually strong enough to be able to do what the car is asking of it. So the rubber stays sticking to the road, but the car is wanting to go that way. And so the rubber stretches and stretches and stretches because part of it is stuck on the road and the car is wanting to move away. And then at a certain point, it stretches and it actually tears. So bits of rubber get left behind on the surface of the road, and the tyre is left with that torn surface. It's a thing you'll sometimes hear the driver describing as the tyre has opened up. And when they say that, they mean they can see the surface aspect of the tyre changing as the tread is torn away from the surface. Now that process, that graining process, it accelerates the wear of the tyre, it reduces the grip of the tyre, and it makes the driver feel uncomfortable because generally it induces understeer and loses them lap time. So Lewis, when he said that he was having a problem with the front left, he was just reporting the onset of that graining. Now happily, graining does not always persist to a level that causes the tyre to sort of go into a death spiral where you have to come into the pits and change it. Sometimes the graining will get going, but then once it's scraped off a bit of the rubber, torn off a bit of the rubber, then the tyre will actually be able to cope. Sometimes you hear them talking about the tyres cleaned up, and that will be where the graining actually stops once it's torn away a certain amount of the rubber. And that's what happened to Lewis. So the graining initiated, but then cleaned up, and he got then a consistent car again. And later on in the stint, when he's talking about it feeling good, didn't mean that it felt like it was brand new or anything, but that graining had not got worse. He was managing it just fine, but also, just as importantly, he knew that the tyres felt lively compared with those people around him. So all the people he was in a race with, he knew that he was doing real damage to them lap time wise. So he didn't want us feeling at all that he needed to come in and get a new set of tyres. He wanted to be left out there because he was really just putting down a load of real haymakers at the time and wanted to do that damage to all his opponents at that point of the race. So he wanted to tell us, tyres are good, leave me alone, let me get on with it, and let me put these really strong lap times in. Unlike most of the people around us on the grid, we started our race on the medium tyre. Others started theirs on the soft, and that meant for us, we had a pretty strong first stint. But the way that we were going to get the best out of the race if we were going to start on a medium was in all likelihood that we were going to run a one-stop race rather than a two-stop. We weren't certain of that at the beginning of the race, but that was certainly our objective. And as the race got going and we started to sort of get through those opening difficult laps, and then we had very good pace, it was pretty clear that that medium tyre was doing really well, and that it was wearing well as well, and that we looked like we could go quite deep into the race. And at the beginning of the race, the only option for us that we had seriously on the table to manage this one stop that we anticipated was to go medium and then hard. We never really thought seriously that we would get so far into the race with the medium tyre that there would be a realistic option of finishing the race on the soft tyre, because we didn't think the soft was really going to be any good for more than maybe 15 or 16 laps. And so we didn't imagine that we would get that far into the race. Nevertheless, it went quite well on the medium tyre. We used the rubber really gently, and we were able to go really quite deep into the race to a point where it started to feel like, yeah, we could go soft in the final stint if we wanted to. And at the time, we were wrestling with the fact that actually quite a few of the teams had done quite well on the soft tyre at the beginning of the race, better in fact than we'd imagined they would. We saw one car do 28 laps on it. We saw several do above 20. And so we were sitting there thinking, well, the soft tyre might actually not be that bad, and how much do we know really about the hard tyre? It's very cold out here. There's some more little showers that look like they might be coming our way sometime soon. Are we going to be confident that we're going to be able to switch the hard rubber on and actually bang out the remaining laps of the Grand Prix with a tyre that is going to go quickly in a decent temperature window? And we were sort of wrestling with that as the medium tyres went along through the race. And as we got deeper into the race, and it became a sort of semi-realistic possibility of finishing the race on the soft tyre. But one of the benefits too about going deep into the race on the medium tyre was that eventually other people started making their pit stops around us and started to go onto the hard tyre themselves. And so from a position of not really knowing that much about the hard tyre, we started to get more and more samples of other people who were using it. And we could see that there didn't look like there was anything to fear there. So at the point where we made our stops, our choice was go soft or go hard, and it just felt to us like there was sufficiently good reassuring evidence that the hard tyre was going to be good, and there were a few cases of the soft tyre starting to look a bit rubbish. And so we chose the hard tyre with Lewis. He got to stop first because he was the leader. And then when Valtteri came in, he expressed a preference for the soft because I guess that would give him a chance of being different to Lewis and maybe rolling a lucky dice. But we were pretty confident by that stage that it was not going to do well for him and that he would be better protected by having the hard tyre. And so that's what we chose. Some of the sharp-eyed ones amongst you would have picked up on the world feed that we had a bit of loose bodywork flapping around on Valtteri's car in the race. That was one of the things we called the louver panels, which are cooling exits on the top of the side pods near the radiator exits, which had just come loose, and it was flapping around a bit on some of the bodywork tape. It's a pretty small beer thing and didn't cause him any significant loss of performance. Much of what you saw on Sunday was a reflection of the fact that the entire grid all through the race was operating on the cold side of where peak grip could be found in the tyres. So everybody's tyres would have been a little bit below the sort of temperature they would have wanted in order to be absolutely humming. And that has an interesting effect because it tends to pull apart cars in their competitiveness. It tends to exaggerate differences. And in fact, if you look at the race, you'll see that the differences in the finishing positions were very exaggerated compared with normal. There were very substantial lap time differences between teammates and also between teams, with much of the grid actually being lapped. And you can think about that in a relatively intuitive way. If you're a little bit too cold, then it means your tyre doesn't generate as much grip as you would like it to be. That means your lap time is not as good as you would like it to be. Now, if for whatever reason, by driving style or by basic car performance, you're able to put a bit more heat into the tyre on the circuit, then you pick up a bit of grip from that. And picking up that bit of grip means that you can go a bit faster. Going a bit faster means that you put more energy into the tyre, which means you pick up a bit more grip. And so you get this sort of positive feedback that allows a small difference to be exaggerated. And you saw that in one way at the start of the race, where the cars that arrived on the grid later, because they're further back down the grid, at the start of the race, they just had a few more degrees in their tyre than those people at the front of the grid. And so you saw some very dramatic, really skillful, impressive work from, say, Kimi, where he drove through practically the whole field as a result of having those small temperature differences, which then just feed back positively over the subsequent corners, because he's getting more and more grip, building up faster and faster than the people who are having to tiptoe because their tyres are a little bit colder and are not benefiting from this positive feedback. You see that at the start of the race, but you also see it during the race in a different way. So as the race then starts to get underway in a more conventional fashion, and let's say our two cars have built enough temperature in their tyres that we're seeing the basic performance of our car come out, well, at that point, the basic performance of our car is putting more energy into our tyres than maybe some of our competitors. And so we were having an easier time of it than we would normally have, stretching away from some of our opponents. And that tendency, when you're on the cold side of the tyre, to exaggerate the differences is sort of quite a well understood thing. And in Valtteri's case, he had a few things that exaggerated that in a way that was difficult for him. For example, when he came in for his pit stop and we put him out on the hard tyres, we probably could have done a better job about exactly when we chose to make that stop and where we left him on the track when he came back out, because he came back out in the midst of a gaggle of people that he was lapping. And that meant that he wasn't able just to come out the pits and just get the hammer down and preserve in his tyres the heat that had been from the blankets. And he had to tiptoe round until he managed to get past those cars he was lapping. And then only 2 or 3 laps later was he able to get the heat in the tyre, and his lap times were then bang on the money with Lewis's. But in the meantime, just those 3-4 laps of tiptoeing meant he lost 5-6 seconds. And it's those small differences of temperature that end up with very, very exaggerated lap time differences in a situation when you're racing on the cold side of the peak. Thanks for all your questions. We'll be back again in a week's time after the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix in Imola to answer a whole bunch more.